I'm Matt Reynolds, and this is my podcast.
I can do the job, but running the business is quite difficult. What a lot of tradesmen lack, and I was probably one of them, is business skills.
I don't mind making mistakes. You learn from your mistakes.
Information is all around you in the minds of people that work beside you.
Welcome back to the Trench Talk podcast. I'm your host, Matt Reynolds, and today I spoke with politician James Newbury, who is the elected Liberal member for Brighton, which is my hometown here in Melbourne, Australia. The idea of these discussions, for those of you joining us for the first time, is to go into the trenches of achievement and talk, not with people who are orchestrating from some lofty perspective, but to those high performers who are actually in the trenches, honing their craft. That has included guests from the worlds of business, sport and entertainment, all of whom are on the front lines doing amazing things. James was born in Melbourne and grew up in East Malvern. During high school, James did bookwork for his father's dental practice, where he first learnt about the burden of overregulation and the challenges of running a small business. James has completed 3 university degrees, including a Juris Doctor and a master's degree in business law. After completing a Master of Business Law, James began working for the Howard Government, eventually moving to Canberra to work at the highest levels of federal government. During his time working in Canberra, James had responsibility for advising many senior ministers and party leaders. After the election of the Abbott Government, James moved back to Brighton with his wife Suzanne, where they started their own family, and they now have 2 young daughters. James worked as senior advisor to then Premier Dr. Dennis Napthine before moving into the private sector. James worked as a group company secretary for the Australian Retail Credit Association, the peak body for organisations involved in credit reporting. In 2016, James decided to put his hand up and represent the Brighton community and be a strong voice for them in Parliament. He was elected to the Victorian Parliament in November of 2018. He is the 14th person elected to represent this community since the electorate of Brighton was first formed in 1856. The electorate is the only Liberal Party held seat to have existed continuously since 1856. During this chat, we covered a lot, including how the role of ministers are changing, safety on the job, including some aspects of mental health, the state and federal systems of government, working with former Prime Minister John Howard, crafting questions for Parliament, his first days in office, why he supports small businesses, a little about the Brighton community, and as always, much more. You can learn more about James and his current work in Brighton at jamesnewbury.com.au. You'll also find many ways to contact James at that same site. If you do enjoy Trench Talk, head to xrm.com.au/podcast and opt in for the newsletter. We'll make sure you're notified when every new episode of the show is released. Trench Talk is available everywhere good podcasts are served, so if you're feeling super nice, please leave a review, comment, rating, or whatever your chosen podcast platform allows. Enjoy this chat with James Newbury. James, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we are in your Brighton offices here this morning.
Yep.
An area where we both live. And we
Best part of the world, I have to say.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, we go to 50 plus countries now, believe it or not, with this podcast, which is pretty crazy for even me to say. But I did want to actually ask you if there's one area of the suburb you continually find yourself talking about with those that don't actually live here.
I am fortunate in that the electorate that I represent covers Elwood, Brighton, Brighton East and Hampton. And it's hard, in fact, it's impossible to have a favourite part of my electorate because for different reasons they're all so incredible. We have a coastline which is about a third of my electorate, the border of my electorate, and a lot of people will know the Brighton bathing boxes. Of the 50 countries you go to, I'm sure we've had people from all 50 come and visit our bathing boxes, but Elwood, Hampton, Brighton East, they're very, very special parts of Victoria and Australia.
Yeah, of course. Now, we were just talking very briefly that the role of MPs has changed dramatically in just the last few years.
Yeah.
So in what way has your role changed, and what does that mean for maybe looking forward into the future as well? Because I can only assume that it will continue to change as it is now.
Look, I've been involved in government in one way or another for about 20 years, and I think you're spot on in saying that the role of a Member of Parliament has changed a lot. 20 years ago, or even less, you were available between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. when your office was open, People would write you letters either on their typewriter or they'd handwrite you letters. You deal with them as a member of parliament and you'd go into parliament and you'd speak on their behalf. That was pretty much your job. Now you are a 24-hour, almost 7-day-a-week job. Social media has meant that you're contactable all the time. Facebook, I think, is one of those things that's terrific because it means you're able to communicate with people a lot, but people also expect a lot from you. So one of the biggest changes I think that's happened for members of parliament is your community will tag you on social media and they'll expect you to have a view on whatever they've tagged you on. Now, if you're getting tagged, half a dozen times a day at least, as well as juggling everything else you're doing, it means you've got to be on top of what's happening in your community. You've got to have views and you've got to have them pretty quick, because I think that as well as email, I mean, I'll give you an example. I reckon I get about one handwritten letter a week. Now, 20 years ago, I probably would have got 5 a day, whereas I would get 25 emails from constituents a day, which is the equivalent of a handwritten letter, nowadays, isn't it?
Yes.
So the volume has actually increased. 20 years ago, if you'd written to your MP, you probably would have expected a response a week or two later. If you email me, I can assure you I get people email me the next day and say, hang on, what happened to my email? And it's very hard to go back and say, look, there's 25 people writing to me every day. I'm getting through them as quickly as I can, but it takes time. And I think the last thing is, because people are contacting you directly now, so for example via email, I don't think there's any latitude for you to not personalise your response. So as a new Member of Parliament, I was elected in November last year. I try and I personally respond to every single email. I write if you get a response back from me on email, that's from me. It's not staff don't draft it or send it. It's James responding to you. So the contactability has increased, the style of contact has increased, and I guess that has also meant that you're available for far more of the day and week than you ever have been before.
So you can only assume that going forward that's going to increase, right? So do you have any ideas about how you would actually handle that? Because this is not an issue that is specific to you, right? This is the challenge of the modern working day man or woman out there, right, that's earning a living and doing the right thing for their family every day. So can you look forward on that and see how that's going to go and how you handle it?
I think there's two aspects to it. Firstly, I think when you're a Member of Parliament, put really, really simply, there are 46,000 voters in my electorate and over 60,000 people in my electorate. When you're voted in, you're their voice. Your job is to be their voice in Parliament. So I think there's an obligation on you to be available to them more so than some other occupations. Not all. I mean, some occupations you would be available a lot of the time. But as an MP, if you're representing a lot of people and they have an issue or a difficulty, you're obligated to help them. What does that mean moving forward? I think that when you stand for Parliament, you need to understand that. It's a very hard thing for people to comprehend, I reckon. I mean, most people probably aren't ready to spend their entire waking life being an MP. And it's very hard to explain to people what the job entails. And, you probably saw at the start of the new Parliament, there were some new MPs that were really struggling with the job, and they publicly spoke about that. We've had, one MP in the current Parliament admit to certain drug and alcohol issues. And over time, you've seen a lot of members of Parliament stand down for their job. I mean, federally, there's a lot of MPs recently who've been standing down from their job because of the job, I would argue. I think it means that MPs need to understand what the job entails, but we also have to think, I think, about some of the difficult aspects of it. And one that I'm pretty passionate about, I'm really passionate about getting good people into Parliament. I think you can never have a shortage of good people in Parliament. And I've spoken to a lot of people I think would be great for Parliament. And one of the issues they talk to me about is the privacy and security concerns. That's an aspect of the job that I think has changed a lot. When you go home at the end of the day, whatever job you're in, you go home at the end of the day, your suburb's your sanctuary. You go down and you buy your milk and your bread in the morning, you spend time with your family. When an MP does it, they're on. I mean, I go down to buy milk and 5 people will tell me about their council concerns or their law concerns or whatever issues they're having at the time. So you're on all the time, which has an impact on the privacy. So I can't walk down the street with my kids without my kids having to understand what my job is. And then that has a flow on to safety and security, because as an MP, you will have interactions with people with mental health issues normally. And sometimes those mental health issues will play out in a negative way. And that's happened to me, unfortunately. And you weigh that up, and, people who I've said to, it'd be great if you, considered representing a community and coming into Parliament, have said to me, that's a pretty big price that they may not be willing to go down in terms of putting their hand up to being an MP. And I respect their view, but I think that those issues we haven't had a public debate or a public discussion about, and I think that it'd be healthy to have those discussions.
Was this something that you thought about when you originally went down this track in terms of becoming part of the political landscape? Because your grandfather was a very well-known dentist.
Yep.
Your father was also a dentist.
Yep.
So is there a reason that you didn't
Skip
go down
dentistry?
skip dentistry and
It's
decide
funny,
to go down
isn't
this
it?
path?
Both of them were very involved in dental politics. So my grandfather was president of the World Dental Association, which is a dental political body, and my dad was president of the Victorian equivalent. So both of them were really, really interested in health policy. My grandfather was part of a group of people who introduced fluoride into Victoria's water. So they were interested in both politics and public policy. And I decided, my grandpa used to sit me on his knee and talk to me about, public policy and politics and what have you. And one day I just said to him, I remember saying to him, if I'm interested in politics, can't I just skip the dentistry part of it? And it was like a light bulb, as a little boy, going off in my head. And I realised that, nothing against their profession, they've done profound stuff for people, but I was interested in the public policy aspect of the job, and I've always been interested in that part of the job. And so I decided to go down that path.
And did you think about these, was the safety aspect with these considerations, was that something you thought about back then, or is that just...
Well, do you know what's funny? When you've been involved in politics for a really long time, and as I say, about 20 years for me, probably a little bit longer now, there are very few things you haven't seen. But when it happens to you, and because the changes have happened, because some of these things have got, I don't want to use the word worse, but been more pronounced over time, it still surprises you. So in my maiden speech, which is my first speech to Parliament late last year, I spoke about animal welfare, which I'm very passionate about, and spoke about duck hunting. I received an enormous number of people contact me over that issue, and some extremely threatening. Now, you wouldn't think in this day and age that if you raise something like your passion for animal advocacy and concerns about duck hunting, that you would have people ringing you telling you they're going to kill you. But it happens. And
it happens.
Oh,
that happened to you.
Yeah. And not one time, lots of times. And in your mind, you think to yourself, crikey, these people actually do have guns.
Well, yeah.
And it was like 2 weeks
hunting,
after I'd become an MP, so I hadn't even gone through the process yet of understanding how security arrangements work for an MP. So I wasn't new into the world of politics in any stretch. But when that happened, that really, really surprised me. And it also hit home because I've got young kids, and as a dad, you don't think about you and your safety, you think about your family.
Of course, changes very quickly when you have kids.
It certainly does. It changes immediately. And so I think that issue, I've had issues with security since I've been a candidate. I was a candidate for 2 years, in fact, before I was elected, and I've had issues going along. But that duck hunting incident caused me enormous concerns.
Yeah, I could only imagine the shocking,
Yep.
particularly being so new to the job. Were they anonymous threats, were they? Because what I'm surprised about in this social media landscape sometimes these days is that it should be anonymous, but it's not, because you can actually track these people down
Absolutely.
if you like. So
You
were they anonymous?
Sometimes
or?
you can, and sometimes people will ring you from their own phone number. As a candidate, I had one person who became very fixated with me, and they were very well known. They used their name. Look, I think the common thread with a lot of the people who threaten MPs, to be honest, there's probably a threat of mental health issues. They're not, people who you would call a classic burglar who is a criminal. You'd say the common thread is that there are mental health issues, and oftentimes they become fixated on an issue that you've raised or you as a person because of that. I would say it's because of that mental health, issue.
And that's probably an area that you need to navigate around in a very particular way, I would guess, for the good of everybody, right?
Well, the police have said to me that if you are divisive or you say controversial things, you should anticipate a higher proportion of people threaten you, or danger, for want of a better term, inverted commas. And I think that makes sense. It's just common sense, isn't it?
Of course, yeah.
But at the same time...
Doesn't make it right.
Well, and if you're elected to speak on your community's behalf, you actually have an obligation to speak out strongly for them. Do you really want to vote for an MP who sits there and signs letters and really does nothing else? I'm not saying that you need someone blowing too hard as their MP, but I reckon that there are important issues happening in every community, and those communities want their MPs having a strong voice on their behalf.
So I can only assume from the way that you're talking now that none of that you've had to go through has curbed your enthusiasm for holding a strong view on different topics from time to time.
It's made me really resolute on the need for security enhancements in the way that MPs are managed. I think that's a public conversation, and I think there's been horrible incidents around the world where things have happened, terrible things have happened, and I just think it's a part of the conversation that, if the profession has changed, we need to talk about it a little bit more. And we probably need to do more in helping people with mental health issues, because if that's the common thread, perhaps we need earlier intervention in helping them.
And is that something that you, in your role, can play a part in? Because this is a very timely conversation to have with what's going on in the community, and there's certainly some really recent public incidences of, the detrimental effects, I guess, of mental health. So is this something that you need to become more involved in? Are you involved? How does that work?
So I think one of the common threads, if you look at some, I'm not sure, but I presume you're referring to some pretty high-profile crimes where there has been a mental health aspect to that person involved. I think that's absolutely right, that there have been some high-profile incidents of that nature. I think one of the most important things with public policy is to raise the importance of an issue. Honestly, as an MP, if you raise the importance of an issue, especially when you're in opposition, it's one of the key ways that you can influence a government to do something about it. I spoke recently about homelessness, and I use that just as a simple example. We need to do more in terms of social housing. Now, if you have 88 members of the Victorian Parliament stand up and say we're not doing enough on social housing, it's very hard for a government to not do anything about it, because you're shaping the conversation, and then the community obviously will buy into that conversation, and MPs, you would hope, are reflecting the social issues at times that the community are concerned about. And mental health, I think, is one of them. There's no point prosecuting a criminal for the crime they've committed if you're not also looking at the underlying cause. It's like a cold or an illness. You've got to get to the root cause. And I'm not using that as a way of apologising for behaviour of a criminal in any way. I think that everybody, who commits a crime should be absolutely accountable for it. But I think understanding why it happens always helps. In fact, I think it's critical. Understanding why it happened.
Particularly if you want to raise the conversation around lasting change, right?
Absolutely.
It makes a lot of sense to start in that area.
That's absolutely right.
So one of the things that I was a little bit confused about, to be honest, was government structure. And you've worked at a federal level, I think, initially, and then before moving back to a state level.
Yeah.
So I thought, would we be able to talk through your political journey and how those state and the federal aspects work, and if, in fact, there is any areas in which you do work together?
Yeah, well, to understand the way government works, we need a podcast of about 50 hours. So let me give it to you in a couple of sentences. Basically, what happened in Australia is the early founders decided that the state and federal parliaments would be responsible for different areas of policy. So some issues are state, some issues are federal. And the list of what is which is in the Constitution. So federal looks after some stuff and the state looks after other stuff.
And to make it really simple again, federal is Australia-wide.
Yep.
State is, of course, the individual state
involved.
Which we sit in the state of Victoria here.
Yep. And the parliaments pass the laws for those areas, and then the departments make sure they happen. So the bureaucrats make sure it all happens. So they administrate it all. That's probably about as concise as I can make it. If only it were that simple.
Can you give an example of something that is a state area versus something that is a federal area, just to kind of make that really real?
Yeah. Primarily, I'll use Victoria as an example. Planning is state parliament thing, and workplace relations is a federal parliament thing. So anything to do with employment and employment laws, the federal parliament will look after, and anything to do with planning, development, anything of that nature is a state parliament thing. So the departments are set up to make sure it all happens, and departments are actually a lot of really well-meaning people who are trying to make things happen. The one thing I've found, so I've worked in, as you mentioned, federal and state context, is that it's important to make sure that people who are bureaucrats, for want of a better, I don't mean that in a rude way, but the bureaucracy understands the practical implication of what they're doing. And I've found, I think small business is a really good example here. I've found that a lot of people who manage departments don't understand how small businesses work. And so when you add red tape, when you add bureaucracy to the way businesses work, a lot of times it's really well-meaning. A lot of times parliaments will do things to administer how an industry works or a sector works, but it will add a level of red tape that is really difficult for businesses to operate. And it's always important, I think, for politicians who at the end of the day are the ones who should be setting the direction to understand that and get rid of it. I think part of a politician's job, and I don't think we'd hear enough politicians say it, is to back small business but also cut out red tape. I think that's part of their job. So that's part of my experience. And after working in parliaments and governments, I went out into the private sector, and that really reinforced my view that governments can do a heck of a lot better in those spaces.
And have you got an example of that? Or maybe the effect of the red tape? Because I can only assume, being a small business operator myself, that there is, although we understand the reason for it, it can put a lot of financial pressure, particularly that's where it shows up first, right?
Well, there was a very high-profile one with the BAS. When BAS statements were first introduced in when the GST came in, there was a level of red tape around those statements that ended up becoming a issue that the whole Australian community went bananas about the level of red tape involved in those statements. And so over time, there have been quite significant changes to try and wind back that red tape. And I always keep in the back of my mind, because it's an absolute truth, small businesses are primarily run by Australian families. And small businesses are the backbone of our economy. When a small business invests $1, it's $1 from the family savings. So when you do anything to a small business, you are saying to an Australian family, we are adding a level of red tape to you and your life. And I remember that every day when it comes to public policy.
So to make that better, is it a case of the two sides working together somewhat? Could they do that better?
I think you will always have a push and pull effect, as you just said, between departments who are trying to administer things as best they can, and usually they'll lean into the most legalistic, bureaucratic way to do it. So they'll want to cross every T and dot every I in making sure forms and requirements cover every eventuality. And they'll propose an approach that is very much that way inclined. Whereas ministers, at the end of the day, are the ones who tick off a lot of this stuff. Ministers, I think, need to push back on that and say, well, hang on, do we really need to do it this way? And departments, at the end of the day, move ideas up to ministers under our system of government, and ministers tick it off. So I think ministers' jobs are to make sure, and government, because I mean ministers are at the end of the day part of a government, and ministers are then part of a cabinet who tick things off. Sorry, this is all getting very bureaucratic, isn't it? There are checks and balances for members of parliament, for ministers and for governments in making sure that the ideas they enforce onto the community are not overly bureaucratic or overly red tape dense.
Makes a lot of sense.
Well, if only we could all do it in practice, hey?
Well, true. But I guess it's something that you've got to continually work on and focus on, because you can always improve, right?
Well, the funny thing is, when you're a minister, and I've seen a lot of ministers' offices work, you will get, federal ministers. I worked for a number of federal ministers. Federal ministers will have, they could walk into their office and have 150 briefs on policy decisions to tick off on. And I mean, you think that through and you say, well, that's a lot of decision making, and it's important that they are thorough about their decision making, but understand that the workload is huge. I mean, the requirement to churn through that work is, in a timely fashion, is important, because if you take an extra day, you're affecting someone. Every minute that you haven't ticked something off is affecting someone. But at the same time, it's got to be right, and it's got to be the best it can be. So I think that, you want your governments to be diligent, timely, but also think through some of those concepts and priorities that we touched on a little bit earlier.
So you started in federal, as you said.
Yeah.
You worked in Canberra for a little while under the Howard government, which is, I guess, in Australian political history, sort of seen as one of the more successful governments, I guess you'd say.
I'd say gold standard. But
can you talk a little bit about your time under the Howard government before you then moved back to private sector, as you just said?
Yeah, look, I think the Howard government was a stable government, a government that set a clear set of priorities. So you knew what John Howard and his government stood for. The ministry were very competent. And look, I've had people who are not Liberals say to me, I didn't necessarily like John Howard, but I knew what he stood for. I knew where he was going to go. I knew where the policy process was going to go. And I think that means a lot to people. I think one of the problems with politics over time has been that people will trade away their values based on political expediency or votes, I guess is the easier way to say it. I don't mean this in a political way. I mean this in a really genuine way now. I think the biggest example of that was Kevin Rudd saying that climate change is the biggest issue of our time, and then changing his policy view on how to do something about that because there was a threat to his leadership. And you can understand why he was worried about his prime ministership. I can get that. But that's one of those issues in the community that I was overwhelmed with people saying to me, how can you think something is the greatest moral challenge of our time and then trade it away to keep a job? And I think that we need, and I think we have it in Scott Morrison, political leaders who stand for something, who are really consistent about it, and let the community know what those things are. And I think the community back leaders of that type.
Yes. I mean, I'm not a political person, so I don't know, but you certainly know just in the social circles that you keep, the people that you meet, integrity and sticking to your word is always a great thing. I think even if there might be short-term effects because as you say...
Even if you don't like the person.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, you can tell, you might not like them, but they're a good person in the sense of what they stand for or whatever. So I understand totally.
And I think that happened a little bit with the federal election, and I say this really impartially now, I put aside all politics. I think that's actually what happened in the federal election. People said, for two reasons, at least I know who Scott Morrison is and what he stands for, and I think there was also a judgment that some people were going to be worse off under Labor's approach on certain policy areas, like, their tax areas. And so they went, well, on those two measures, we're going to vote for the guy who's there. So I think that standing for things consistently is really important, letting the people know who you are. It's a bit twee, but maybe authenticity is what it's about, being a straight shooting person who has views and remains consistent to them. I think that means a lot. But yeah, I mean, going back to your question, I worked in the federal system initially under John Howard and stayed there for quite some time. In fact, I lived in Canberra for 7 years. I managed the federal parliament for the Liberal Party. Now, what does that mean? That means that I made sure or had oversight of what we did as a party in the parliament, how we voted, whether we moved amendments on bills, also helped draft every question for question time for 5 years. So I reckon I've written more federal parliamentary questions than almost anyone else in Australia.
Just to dive in just a little bit there, how do you think about structuring those questions? Is there a sort of kind of like a system that sits behind the questions that you ask, and there might be an issue that you want to raise? So is there a way that you think about constructing the question to give it the most legs?
I am a great believer in not overcomplicating things. So my written language, probably partly because of the amount of questions I've written, is quite straightforward. It's not flowery, it just gets to the point. And there's no real gotchas or tricks. When I write a question, I think through how many words do I have to use to make a simple point and ask a simple question, because at the end of the day, the way Parliament works is the opposition's job is to keep the government accountable. That's actually what their job. That's what question time's all about. I mean, now it's a lot of preening and showboating, but at the end of the day, question time is an opportunity for the whole Parliament to ask the government questions and make sure that they're accountable, which at its core is a really important concept. It's critical to our democracy. So I tried to make sure that whenever I drafted a question, that was what was at its core, keeping the government accountable on an issue. But secondly, I tried to always be consistent to a set of priorities or issues that I thought were, you've got to keep in mind that there are, different priorities and different policy issues that are going at the time. I mean, there are governments are mucking up in certain areas more so than others at a particular time, but it should always link back to a theme without getting too deep. So I'm a big backer of small business. I'm also a big backer of aspiration. So I think that if you want to work hard, you should be rewarded for it. Those general themes, I think, you can always put into the heart of your question. So in Victoria, we've said quite a bit about the solar panel muck up with the solar panel policy, because at the heart of that issue, people started small businesses to deliver solar panels, and because the program's mucked up, there's a whole heap of small businesses who are falling apart, basically. They're sacking people, they're closing their doors, and so the heart of that issue is actually about backing people who started small businesses based on a policy promise which hasn't come to fruition. So when you write questions, that's my long-winded way of saying, you just remember who it is that you're standing up for, why you're asking the question, and making sure that it's holding the government to account.
So you worked directly with John Howard on some of this stuff. Have I got that right?
So I reckon I did stuff for every leader since John Howard. I had a lot to do with I don't know if you remember, but in 2007 there was an advertising campaign about Kevin Rudd's front bench having 70% former union officials, which John Howard led the charge on. So I did the work behind that figure. So, yeah, I worked very closely with a lot of the senior leadership from John Howard. I mean, I started with Joe Hockey when he was Workplace Relations Minister. So I had a lot to do with workplace relations and unions and all of that stuff, work choices. I had a lot to do with that. And then worked through with every opposition leader closely, primarily because when you're writing or drafting the questions for Question Time every day that they read out, you are working very closely with the person to make sure you've got their flavour, to make sure that they obviously correct your drafts, because at the end of the day you're giving them an idea that they build on. So Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott, and even Scott Morrison. I worked very closely with Scott Morrison when he was in the Shadow Ministry. So, yeah, all through then.
And what is John Howard like as a person? Because you often hear great things said about him and his period in government. He seems to be, from what I know, and at the end of the day, like, I don't have the contact that you obviously have had with him, he almost seems a little understated in the way that he goes about things, and I'd say a humble person in some ways. Is that a fair assessment? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't on his staff, but did work that he used or that that was briefed up to him. But I was in meetings and saw, through campaigns and what have you, saw him closely in terms of his personality and what have you. I think that you're spot on in terms of him just being a regular bloke who is very humble. I think that's absolutely right. He is one of the smartest guys that I've ever seen. And that doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's not that he doesn't come across as smart. I think he does come across as smart.
I agree.
But his depth of intellect, I don't think you can probably measure when you see him on TV. So he's the kind of guy, and look, the exact details will be slightly off, but I mean, it's pretty close. I remember one advisor saying to him in about, 2006, Prime Minister, the unemployment rate in February 1982 was XYZ. Now, we're talking, 30 years prior, in 1 month. So every month there's a new unemployment rate. And he said, I think you'll find, and I think it was 0.1 different than the number he'd been given. His mind had immediately recalled a stat that I don't even know if I could find it on the internet, let alone in my brain. His precision was incredible. His depth of knowledge was incredible, or is. His capacity to soak in information was really profound. And at the end of the day, more than anything else, he is diligent and he is driven. I think those are the closest words I could use to describe him, diligent and driven. He knows exactly who he is. He knows exactly who he wants to stand up for, and he can take any issue. I mean, you see it now. I don't know if you follow him, but, I mean, he gets asked about issues now, and his one-sentence response will be so spot on and will so neatly sum up an incredibly broad issue that you think, wow, he still has this uncanny ability to do that. So, I mean, those are probably the reflections I'd make on him.
And I wish I had that ability in some ways that I could apply to my own questioning.
There are other pollies that do it. I mean, though he wasn't Premier for very long, Dennis Napthine had the same capacity with information. He has an incredible capacity with information. I think now I'm going to say something a little bit more controversial, but I think that Daniel Andrews has said some things that very cleverly surmise issues, and I think that he has the capacity to touch parts of the community that potentially politicians haven't been very good at getting into. So I think that his comments, he has a very good knack of understanding how women think. And I mean, that's probably a reflection I'd make about him. So there are other pollies who have strong skill sets.
So after the stint in federal government, you went to the private sector.
Yep.
And how long were you in that private sector?
Off the top of my head, best part of 5 years, I think.
Okay, roughly speaking. So why the move back into politics, and then why at the state level as opposed to the federal level?
Two very good questions. I didn't think that I would go back into politics. I left because I wanted to spend time with my young family. I just had my first daughter and was, making a big change in industry and life. But when the local member in my area retired or announced her retirement, and she and I are very close, I don't know, you know what played in my head more than anything else? The idea that my community deserved someone who would speak strongly on its behalf. And this community has had incredible members of parliament. The last two members of parliament were profound. Before Louise Asher, who was the first female deputy leader of the Liberal Party in Victoria ever, and nearly 10 years at that, by the way. So she is a profound woman, an extraordinary woman. We had Alan Stockdale, who was the Victorian Treasurer, and most people will say that Alan Stockdale was probably the best treasurer this state's ever had. So we had two MPs in this area who were extraordinary members of parliament. And when Louise said she was going to retire at the next election, I thought, we actually need we need an MP who's going to get stuff done and, be good at it. And so that really played in my mind. And having worked at both a federal and state level, I decided that federally, it's very, very hard if you have a young family to be a federal MP. In fact, it's excruciatingly hard. You are away so much, it has a profound impact on your family. Most federal MPs won't publicly say it, but their job has an enormous impact on their family and their kids. And that was a price that, I wanted to be there for my kids. And, I may only sleep in my bed at night and be out for most of the day, but at the end of the day, I am in the household every single day. So I decided that state, for that reason, was the path I would go down. And secondly, I felt that the Liberal Party's only won one election in the last 20 years at a state level. So I thought there was an opportunity to add something to the state team. I'm not reflecting on the state team in any way. I'm not saying anything other than I wanted to help make sure it was more than one win in 20 years.
And were you friends with Louise, or friends, acquaintances beforehand? You knew her before she announced her retirement?
So after working in the federal government system, I then came down and very briefly worked in the state system. Mm-hmm. And managed...
before going to the private sector?
Before going to the private sector.
Just briefly,
just for about not quite 18 months. I actually managed the state parliament for then the Premier, Dennis Napthine. So I had the federal parliamentary experience and came down and did the state, managed the state parliament. And the person responsible, it's called the leader of the House, at that time was Louise Asher. So Louise Asher and I worked very, very closely, and that's how I got to know her. And it's funny, when I was a young boy, just joined the Liberal Party, I dug it out just before my pre-selection and showed her. Louise came to a meeting that I attended and spoke, and I remember writing her a little note to say, I must have been about 18 or 19 years old, I was young, to say how unbelievable I thought she was and, how incredible she was as an MP. And I dug it out before my pre-selection because she has always struck me as someone who was so incredibly talented, and I had the great fortune of working closely with her in managing the state parliament and getting to know her. She's very much loved. In my electorate, Elwood is a new part of the Brighton electorate, but Brighton's obviously always been the Brighton electorate, the Brighton suburb. And in Brighton, Louise is exceptionally known and very, very, very much loved. So I had very, very big shoes to fill in taking over from her.
So walking in on day one,
Yep.
knowing you had big shoes to fill,
Yep.
what do you do?
Well, on day one, they were still counting my votes. So after the election...
So I'm not familiar with this. So was it very close?
Yeah. Well, there was a very profound outcome at the state election. The Liberal Party was reduced to 21 of the 88 seats in the parliament. And of the seats that we do have, they are on very slender margins. So the Liberal Party did not win easily. For the first time in a heck of a lot of those seats, we didn't win an absolute majority of 50+1% of the votes in those areas, including in Brighton electorate. So what happens in that case is if less than 50+1 people vote for you, it takes a really long time to count them.
Because they do actually have to count each
individual ballot, and you think it through. There's 45,000 ballots. And so then what they do, once they count all the ballots and they put them on big tables, funnily enough, it's very old-fashioned, they have to count your second preference. So when you fill out a ballot, you have to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many people there are. If no one gets to 50+1, they count the twos. And then the twos get added into your pile. The easiest way to think about it is in most seats, Liberal and Labor will always be 1 and 2 in terms of the volume. It'll be 1 or 2.
Of course, yeah.
Everybody else on that ballot paper, let's say there's 5 other candidates, independents, Greens, whatever it is, they will never be in the top 2. So if you don't make it to 50+1 and you're not from those top 2, all the rest of the piles get distributed into those big 2 piles. So if you put 5 as, independent Joe Smith, all Joe Smith's votes will go into those 2 big piles for the major parties. So your preferences really, really matter, because if those 2 candidates at the top are under 50%+1, all those preferences decide who wins. So day one, they were still counting, and it took, I think, a week and 3 days to count all the votes and confirm it. And then I think that was a Wednesday when I was confirmed, and I called the Parliament as soon as I got the special letter which says you're confirmed, and said, right, when can I have the office key? And I was in the office on Friday, and I had the shingle out, in my electorate office on the Friday of that week.
So what did you start working on from a community aspect?
The contactability is the number one thing you do. So you're basically making sure your phones work, you're answering the phones, you've got an email address so people can contact you.
People know you've actually won.
Yeah. Those basic things. Making sure that you've got staff to help you, make sure you've got letterhead and pens. Because you come into the office, funnily enough, you don't have letterhead, you've got some pens, you might have some blank envelopes, maybe. Not every office has them. You come into the office with far less than you can possibly imagine.
Sounds like moving out of home for the first time
exactly
when you
like that.
Go into maybe a rental with a bed and a blanket, and
that's exactly what
you
it's
walk
like.
around empty rooms.
Yeah, and you've got to then go in and say, right, what do I need to make sure it all works? So you work out, what do you want for your stationery? what's your letterhead going to look like? I mean, those basic decisions that, to get yourself up and running. So there's a lot of that. But I also had my first speech to Parliament 10 days after getting my office key. And historically, the first speech you give to Parliament is thought to be the most important speech you'll ever give to Parliament. So when you die as an MP or as a former MP, they will look to your inaugural speech. It's the most important speech you'll ever give. So knowing that 10 days after I got the office key, I was giving my inaugural speech, I hadn't even thought about my inaugural speech before being elected. It gave me a laser-like focus about making sure that my first speech properly captured what I wanted it to capture. So I did spend a bit of time on that, to be frank with you.
And that's available on your website and on your Facebook page. I'm sure if you want to delve in and look at that.
Yeah, I've got a special link on my website for my first speech, and your biography and all that stuff on the parliamentary webpage has a special link to it too.
So I wanted to bring this in as we sort of come towards a close here.
Yeah.
Brighton specific stuff that you're working on and that at the moment. Can you talk a little bit about what you've achieved up until now and the things that you're doing for the community to paint a little bit more of a picture in a lot of ways of what you go about day to day?
Yeah.
Because talking to people in preparation for this, what an MP or someone in government does, when they're not in an electoral cycle in terms of being elected is somewhat of a mystery for some people.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think that goes to some of the things we were touching on earlier. I think one of your measures of success, and success is probably not the right word, but to whether or not you're doing a good job, is whether your community knows what you're doing. And one of the things I hope over time is that my community can look at me as the MP and see things that I'm doing. I'll give you an example. I mean, the government released a policy a couple of months ago, a draft policy suggesting that bathing boxes weren't appropriate for the beach and the foreshore. Now, saying that you want to get rid of the bathing boxes on Brighton Beach is it's an act of wow. It certainly galvanises the community, I can tell you. And so I found the policy and publicly said, "Are you nuts? We're not getting rid of the Brighton bathing boxes. Government, please stop your plan to get rid of the Brighton bathing boxes." And I think a good proportion of this community agreed and recognised that. In fact, I cannot tell you how many people called me about that issue. One of the things I did as a candidate is make a decision that I wanted to be very, very contactable. So I gave out my mobile phone number. I'm told that now, in hindsight, that it's not common to give out your mobile phone number. But when issues like that happen, you literally get hundreds of calls, literally, within hours of your phone. You cannot manage your phone because of the volume of calls. And that's an example of an issue where as an MP I can say, I'm speaking on behalf of my community and I'm saying to the government, don't get rid of our bathing boxes. In this last weekend, The Age did a big piece on a plan to get rid of a much-loved and very, very high-quality kindergarten from the Elwood foreshore for a very similar reason, that the government determined that a kindergarten is not appropriate for the foreshore. And I spoke out very strongly about protecting the kindergarten, and hopefully the government will see reason in not wanting to evict the kinder. So as an MP, I think your job, you help people every day on little things all the time, but on some of the bigger things, you find examples of the government proposing to do things in your community that are wrong, and it's your job as an MP to say, don't do that. Or sometimes they'll do things that are right, and, I'm looking forward to finding an example of that one day. I don't mean to make light of it, but one of the downsides in this electorate is that we have not got a fair proportion of government funding. The government won't release the metrics, of course, but if you look at the way government money is distributed, this community is disproportionately low on the list. So, I mean, I've got a school in my electorate that has signs around the walls saying to the kids, don't touch the walls or you'll disturb the asbestos. Now, I mean, in this day and age, I go into the school and it's little kids that have to deal with those signs. I mean, it's not actually the signs, it's the asbestos that's the problem. Do we really think that type of service provision is adequate? You know, and I can give you a whole list of examples where my job is to advocate on behalf of my schools, on behalf of my kinders, on behalf of childcare centres. You know, in Hampton, we've got a crossing, a pedestrian crossing that's unfortunately and tragically a grandmother from Hampton was killed there because there's no warning, there's no gates, there's no bells on the pedestrian crossing and the government won't put any in. Someone's died there. So my job on a day-to-day basis is to advocate for money to fix those things. But at the same time, the other side of the day-to-day job is to help people with their issues. And, you know, when you have difficulties in whatever form, whether it's with government departments that could do better, whether you have a business that needs help in a certain way, perhaps it's planning. And I reckon that planning now is one of the biggest parts of my job, and concerns about overdevelopment, densification. All of these things are ways that your MP can and should be helping.
I did want to ask about the council component, because I'm not sure whether the council is in some ways misunderstood, and they probably are in some aspects, but they also seem incredibly inefficient. In terms of planning would be a good example for, you know, maybe a developer doing a project and getting the answers quickly and concisely out of a council. And not only, we're not directing this just at this electorate, obviously, but more broadly. Sometimes it's very hard to get a quick and concise answer, which goes back to the heart of the community is the small business operator, which then can cost them, in some instances, money. So is that fair, first of all, to say that? And if it is there a way that we can improve on that?
I think at the end of the day, one of the best things about democracy is if democratically elected people don't do well, they'll get voted out. It's a really good pressure mechanism. So my local council, and none of these comments reflect on my local council, just to make it clear, because we're talking, as you said, we're talking about the general concept. But in my case, my council is based not in my electorate. It's based quite some way away. And so everybody in this part of the council area, they don't drive all the way down to where council's based. They come and see me. And I get a lot of people who come and see me about council issues. I mean, I reckon dozens a day probably. And I think that it's my job to help represent them. And because it's not my level of government, so I'm not actually a local councillor, you do it in a polite way, because the last thing local council want is, you know, a state or federal MP telling them, you know, how to do their job. But I think that if you consistently see systemic issues and people are coming to you with systemic issues, I think it's your job as a democratically elected person to go to whatever level of government it is and say, hey, this is the 5th, 6th, whatever it is, time this issue's been raised with me. Is there a systemic issue that might need looking at? And so it's perhaps the most eloquent way I can say is sometimes fixing problems is as much about gentle persuasion as anything else. And there are important things that sometimes need to be addressed and changes that need to be made. And I think as an MP, you are privileged to see, because people will share with you their stories. And if there's an issue that you need to raise with another level of government, and I do it at a federal level as well. I mean, we've got a great federal MP that I work very closely with in this local area. If I have issues come that, you know, are federal to me, I'll ring him up and say, mate, you know, we've got an issue with this. What do you reckon? And at the Elwood end of my electorate, I've got a different federal MP who I've tried to have a relationship with, even though he's not from the same political party as me. And unfortunately, I've tried to ring him privately about issues, and, he's perhaps not as receptive. But I think our job as elected representatives is to try and make things work and fix problems for people. And no one wants to walk into an MP's office and get told it's not my level of government. You want it fixed, and you want me to help you get it fixed. And, sometimes, as I said, I think getting it fixed is as much about gentle persuasion as anything else, but it's my job to help make sure it happens.
So I want to be respectful of your time because, as you said at the beginning, we could probably talk for hours about a number of these different issues that we've covered, probably just lightly, really. Just a couple of questions before we do wrap up then. Yep. Do you have any book or documentary recommendations?
Do you know what? I wish I had time to read. I mean, my wife is now the reader in my household because it's, as dorky as it sounds, I go to bed at night and I will often sit responding to emails or writing newsletters, and she will read a novel, and I will be so jealous. So I have not had the opportunity to read for leisure well before I was elected. I can recommend a lot of government documents because unfortunately that's all I seem to be reading at the moment. But I did say to my wife, I wouldn't mind going into the local bookstore around Christmas time and at least promising myself that I buy one book and finding just, half a day to indulge on relaxing and reading a novel.
So maybe we should say if anyone listening to this has a good book recommendation to actually contact you and give you the recommendation.
That's actually true. Send me an email because I promise you I'll respond to it. And if it's at 10 o'clock at night, it's while I'm lying in bed while my wife reads a good novel.
Now, if you could have one law changed or implemented, what would that be? Another question that I do ask everybody.
Yeah, look, I think that we need a massive rethink about our planning laws. We've had enormous population growth and we are having enormous population growth. And the biggest issue that people come and see me about, bar none, is that densification of our communities, and it is, our communities are being densified at a rapid rate of knots. It's not being done in a way that protects our amenity and our way of life. So we are having apartment blocks built on the corner of every main street now. In fact, most of them have at least one, and which means that the second one's probably going in. The associated infrastructure and services perhaps aren't up to date. So, I know it sounds like a little thing, but if you put in a heck of a lot more people in your community, you won't have enough parking. Really important issue. If you put in a lot more people, you perhaps won't have a safety pedestrian crossing for people to cross that on a main road. And that's critical. We've got a main road called Glen Huntly Road in Elwood where all the local schools cross over, all the little kids cross over, and the government won't agree to put in a safety crossing. Now, you think that would be a no-brainer, and it's not even a very expensive thing. So if we're going to be packing people like sardines into all of our suburbs, we've got to be investing in the associated infrastructure and services to make sure that our communities are livable. So planning, big planning law changes.
Is there anything you wanted to add, James, before we wrap this up?
No, look, I really appreciate the opportunity. I think we've covered enormous amount of ground. So I'm really impressed. You've managed to get a conversation that has covered an enormous amount of ground, and I hope that it's been of interest to people. And I'd say to anybody that I'm available, and I mean this really genuinely, if people have any questions or follow-up thoughts, I try to be very, very contactable. My email is so easily Googleable, but my website, James Newbury, which is newbury.com.au, has my details on it. And I'm more than happy to help out in whatever way that I can. So thanks for that.
Thank you for being part of it, James.
Terrific.
Hey everybody, it's Matt again. Thanks for listening. Just a couple of things before you guys clock off. You can get all Trench Talk episodes at xrm.com.au/podcast. You can also sign up for other goodies at the same site. Just plonk your email in there and you are covered. That's X for X-ray, R for Romeo, M for Mike.com.au podcast. If you really like what I'm bringing you, please head to iTunes, subscribe to this show, and leave a review right there. And lastly, if you want to contact me directly, type the @ symbol followed by Mr. Matt Reynolds into your search bar and you'll find all the social links. Goodbye.